The story begins on an unidentified world in an unidentified kingdom. In this kingdom were a group of powerful mages. There were 5 in total. They collectively were known as the 5 Shining Generals. Now, we've talked about one of them already, this being the Winter General Isaiah. However, it's time that we talk about the other Shining General that managed to survive the encounter with the Sky Warriors, which we now know to be the Cyratin Empire. This individual was known as Leon, and during his service, he was known as the Gilded Bolt. Now, when Leon joined the Cyratin Empire, he got a vastly different introduction than, say, Isaiah did, and this is largely due to the fact that Leon possessed what is known as form magic. We've talked about it before, but to give you a refresher, form magic is a type of casting. Obviously, there are things like runic spell magic, silent spell casting, stuff like that. Form is another one. However, form is very interesting because the way that form magic works is there are a set of spells, 8 in total, and these spells are always the same, which means that if you know what element they're using and you know that they're a form magic user, you know what 8 they're going to use. Now, you may be wondering, why would you use something that is so incredibly predictable? After all, the whole point of it is to use spells that your enemy is not going to be expecting and be able to win that way. The reason is because form magic is very efficient. There are 2 things that we need to worry about when it comes to form magic. This is the overall efficiency and something known as the compatibility. Now, what is efficiency? Well, the more efficient a spell is, the less mana that it uses. Form magic has been used by billions upon billions of generations of mages, and as a result, each and every single one have slowly made this series of spells more and more efficient, to the point where they use almost no mana whatsoever, which allows you to use more spells during a specific engagement rather than less. Now, what is compatibility? Well, certain spells are more compatible with others. What this means is, let's say we're using fire magic, and let's say that we have 2 spells. We have Fireball and we have Seer. These 2 spells are very compatible with one another for whatever reason. Not necessarily because they're the same element, but Fireball and Seer are compatible, which means the time it takes for you to cast Fireball and then follow up with Seer is very short because they're very compatible. Now let's say we're using something like Fireball and Pyroclasm. Pyroclasm is a very big, showy spell that does a lot of damage, but it's notorious for not being very compatible with a lot of other things. Suddenly, the time it takes you to cast the Fireball and then follow up the Pyroclasm is incredibly long because the spells are not compatible with one another. This can even go down to different elements. Fire and ice magic obviously are naturally not very compatible, which means if you try to go from a Fireball to an Icicle spell, you're not going to be casting them very fast. This is one of the reasons why form magic is so nice, is because every single spell is compatible with one another to such an extreme level that you can basically chain them together incredibly quickly, allowing you to lay down fire in a very short time span. Now, let's get back on topic. Leon. Leon's introduction to the Cyratin Empire was very different from Isaiah's. Isaiah was far more powerful than Leon, but he just had, albeit be very powerful form of basic ice magic. Not particularly amazing. Compare this to Leon, who had lightning form magic. Now, whilst form magic isn't exactly rare or uncommon, the Cyratin Empire doesn't really have a lot of experience with it. As a result, they decided, well, this individual is using a type of magic that we typically don't see that often. Let's put him in a special operations force, which is exactly what they did. Now, despite this fact, just like with Isaiah, Leon did not have a great start. This is due to the fact that the Cyratin Empire back at this time was fairly xenophobic. Basically, anything that wasn't Cyratin, whilst there was no form of, like, actual attacks or anything, there was a lot of, like, bigotry and talking down to them, viewing them as a lesser life form, despite the fact that the Cyratin Empire, even back then, was chock full of various different species. Well, it just so happened that the Cyratin Empire is almost constantly at war with humans, and as a result, having 2 new humans, especially mages, didn't sit well with a lot of people. Now, we've talked about some of the hardships of Isaiah, but we need to talk about the hardships of Leon, as that's today's episode. Leon was inducted into a special ops task force. He was known as a special operative, and unfortunately, with the way the Cyratin Empire does things, a lot of times these brand new formed special op teams would be sent out on what could best be described as suicide missions. You know, they would go in there and there was no expectation that they were going to come back. There was no expectation that they were going to make it out alive, but there was the expectation that, to some degree, they would get the objective done. Well, time and time again, whether the full force of the team came back, or a small part of it, or even just Leon himself, time and time again, Leon would come back from every single one of these operations. Naturally, people were very suspicious, but they couldn't really do anything due to the fact that, due to the nature of special ops teams, they essentially have body cams. They essentially have body cams on them at all times, which is recording video and audio, and even in various different measurements in the environment around them, to ensure that when this video gets back to their superiors, they have a lot of information about the current situation, especially if they fail their objective. Well, time and time again, Leon would come back, and time again, these videos would show Leon doing everything in his power to make sure that his teammates came back alive, despite the fact that a lot of times they just outright didn't. And this is largely due to the fact that these teams are oftentimes 10-man teams, you know? For a small squad, especially for something like a special ops team, that's fairly large, but you have to remember that these are essentially veterans. These are people who have been trained in it. They know how to do these various different types of missions. So it's the expectation that 10 is enough to get it done, but 10, like, less than 10, you won't have enough to get the mission done, but more than 10, you risk getting found out before you can actually do your objective. Regardless, Leon started to gain some, what's the proper word here? Some fame, I guess, amongst other soldiers of his group. Basically, more and more special ops teams started to realize just how powerful Leon was, but nobody really ever wanted to work with him, as he was quickly starting to be seen as a bad luck charm. Every single time he was setting out on an operation, the majority of the time he would return alone, despite the fact doing everything he can to get the objective done, whilst also saving his fellow man. As a result, it became more and more difficult for people to it became more and more difficult for his superiors to put him in teams, and as a result, Leon was almost cursed with the fact that he was on these suicide missions, as every single time he survived an op, he would be put in a brand new team. Well, they would be sent out on these types of missions, kind of to test the water, see what they were capable of, with an expectation that they're probably not going to come back alive. As a result, Leon got an astonishing amount of experience and learned more and more various different tactics and how to survive, how to complete objectives, and how to get other people back alive. Eventually, some fairly high-ranking officials started to notice this human known as Leon. He had a service record far larger than the majority of special op groups, and every single time he was successful in his mission and he came back alive. This is around the time that Leon started to become a legend in the Cyratin Empire. Now, we've talked about this before, people who are considered legendary individuals. And as of this time, there are 3 individuals in total who have reached a legendary status. Everybody in the Cyratin Empire knows them. They may not know what this individual does, but they know this name, almost every single corner. The first 2 individuals are Cyratin Marine General, Captain James Beckett. Despite the fact that Captain isn't an actual rank within the Cyratin Marines, James Beckett is absolutely determined to be called Captain, for reasons that honestly nobody really knows other than the Marine himself. The only other person who has gained legendary status is Cyratin Marine, Cyratin Supreme Commander Marcus Bane. And now there's a brand new one. Human Special Operative Leon. It was around this time that he was officially given his old title as an official Cyratin title known as the Gilded Bolt, largely due to the fact that when it comes to lightning magic, it's all about speed. It's very similar with wind magic. Wind and lightning are very focused on speed. This not only helps with Leon his casting speed, he can cast spells significantly faster than other elements, but he's also just very fast, and due to the fact that electricity is, lightning magic in general, is usually a pale or yellow color, the name kind of fit and it stuck. The Gilded Bolt. Leon continued his misadventures as a special ops team until one specific mission. You see, up to this point, just like with James Beckett and Marcus Bane, Leon had a truly flawless record. Yes, there may have been casualties, yes, there may have been some close calls, but every single operation that he went on was a success. Every single one. And only Marcus Bane and James Beckett are capable of claiming the same thing. Those two have never failed a mission. They've lost soldiers. They've lost countless numbers of supplies, weaponry, and armor. But they've never failed a mission. And this is another reason why they're considered to be absolutely legendary individuals, especially within the Cyratin Empire. This specific mission was unlike any other. The mission was simple in theory, but almost impossible in practice. The Cyratin Empire had discovered a specific planet that humanity had recently conquered. For whatever reason, this planet was considered absolutely vital to the war efforts of both sides. This wasn't a situation where the planet could be ignored, nor was it a situation where the planet could simply just be destroyed and we move on. This planet had to be held by both factions. Unfortunately, humanity had claimed the planet first, and they were constructing a special reactor. It was the first of its kind, and theoretically it could produce enough power to power some incredibly nasty planetary to orbital defense cannons, to the point where the Cyratin Empire would have to allocate insane resources just to take the world back. However, there was one caveat. The reactor itself was within a massive, heavily armored casing. Now, we've talked about corrodium plate before, and that 1/8 and 1/8 inch thick is usually considered extreme levels of armor. 1/2 inch thick is seen on some of the heaviest battleships. 1/8 is seen on Cyratin Marine armor. However, this casing was 3 inches thick, solid corrodium plate. There was short of barely anything that could actually get through this, and as a result, it was considered to be absolutely vital to take out this reactor before the casing was completed. As a result, the Cyratin Empire decided, we're not sending in rookies on this one. This mission is far too important because we're only going to get one shot at this. As a result, they still had a few months before the theoretical deadline. They took some of their most experienced, their most elite operatives and put them in a team. Now, they naturally know that this team isn't going to have good chemistry right off the bat, especially given the fact that Leon is going to be a part of it. Not a lot of operatives trust Leon despite his flawless surface record. So as a result, they were sent on multiple missions until they got to the point where they were comfortable with one another. And then it was time. They theorized that it was roughly a few days until the casing was going to be completed, at which point there was basically no hope of getting inside of the thing. Not only this, but security had been massively increased due to humanity theorizing that this exact situation was going to come to pass, that they would be sending in a special ops team. This was their one and only shot, and they decided to take the shot. The team was deployed onto the planet, and it took them a good while to get to the facility itself. They didn't want to raise the alarm, therefore they went as quietly into the facility itself. They managed to find an opening. Unfortunately, they didn't have a vital bit of information. This information was the fact that every single possible entry point, even entry points that are too small for a full-grown man to enter in through, had special scanners and sensors, and when it detected something that is not supposed to be there, the alarm would be raised depending on what sensor was tripped. Unfortunately, the alarm was raised. The entire facility was on full alert, but they didn't have the option of turning around. This was quite literally, as I've said multiple times, their last chance. They had to get in there. They had to get the job done, no matter the cost. As a result, they breached through the facility and quite literally run and gun their way through the entire facility. Countless soldiers lay dead before them, but unfortunately their numbers were dwindling. One here, one there. Keep in mind, they're only a 10-man team. Every single loss is a crippling loss. Eventually, they finally get to the chamber that the reactor is housed in. Unfortunately, the soldiers of humanity had plenty of time to fortify the chamber before the team actually got there. Of the initial 10-man team, only 3 survived, 2 veteran soldiers and Leon himself. When they entered into the chamber, it was absolute pandemonium. Gun nests, snipers, and riflemen everywhere. Absolutely nowhere to take cover other than a pre-planned location that was set up by humanity. It provided them just enough cover to stay alive, but the cover wasn't exactly great. The entire chamber had been cleared of anything that could have been used as cover. As a result, whilst they certainly did try to take down the forces in front of them, even ducking back into the corridor when they had the chance, there was little to no possibility. You see, half of Leon's form magic requires direct line sight with the sky. This is one of the reasons why they struggled so much. Leon was massively handicapped, and the spells that he could use, they didn't provide that much of a bonus. Now we're not gonna go over each of the lightning spells, but we are gonna cover 2 in specific. You see, I've been saying that lightning form magic, or form magic in general, only has 8 spells. Well, that's not entirely true, as there's technically 10. However, the last 2 are considered to be forbidden by any practitioner. This is largely due to the fact that either the level of damage that this spell could cause was far too high, or, in the case of lightning magic, it has a negative effect on its caster. The 9th spell is known as Red Line, essentially pushing Leon's body to its limits, imbuing him with lightning magic, and basically capable of using all 8 of the form magic, even without direct line of sight with the sky, essentially boosting his overall capabilities. The 10th form is known as Light Speed, which, whilst there's almost no information on it, I'll leave your imagination to guess to what it does. Eventually, Leon was the only one still standing. He couldn't retreat. He couldn't do anything. He couldn't move forward, but he knew that he had to finish this objective. There was no way around it. As a result, he decided to do something that he never thought he'd have to. He used it. Lightning form magic, 10th form, Light Speed. The second that he got done saying it, it was as if time froze around him. Energy bolts and kinetic rounds suspended in midair. Soldiers mid-shout, mid-fire, mid-reload. Everything had just stopped. Leon was astonished. At first he thought he had stopped time until he realized that his perception of time was so slow because his body, despite not actively moving, was moving at light speed. That's when he felt it. His left shoulder. There wasn't any pain, but he could feel his left shoulder quite literally disassembling itself due to the incredible strain that his body was already under, again, despite the fact he wasn't even moving yet. He realized that he was on a timer and sprinted towards the housing. Now, unfortunately for Leon, and fortunately for humanity, they decided to put the door on the opposite side of the casing, which means that they couldn't even throw a grenade or maybe even a rocket in there to destroy it, as they had quite literally had to go through the defensive line to get to the door. Luckily, moving quite literally at light speed, such a thing doesn't really matter. By the time Leon actually reached the door, the majority of his body was already falling apart, but he noticed something critical. The force that was in his body was immense, to say the least. Not only this, but imbued with so much lightning magic that he didn't even think such a thing was possible. He theorized that simply just by punching the reactor, as idiotic as that sounded, would be enough to destroy it. And that's exactly what he did, pulling back his fist right as his right shoulder was starting to disassemble itself and slamming his fist into it. From the perspective of the human soldiers, they didn't even see what had happened. Within less time than it takes for your neurons to fire in your brain, Leon was gone and an explosion of impossible power was caused behind them. What had happened is that Leon, with a quite literally moving at light speed fist colliding with the reactor, caused a tremendous, impossible amount of force to erupt from his fist into the reactor, which then caused an insane amount of force to erupt from the opposite side of the reactor into the housing, unpeeling the housing, which, remember, is 3 inches corrodium to unpeel like a banana, sending out shrapnel quite literally at near light speed, completely obliterating the forces there, and completely, once again, unpeeling the entire facility in that direction like a banana. It was like a shaped charge that was loaded with a nuclear bomb. The devastation was impossible. Now, the second that Leon had accelerated himself to light speed, High Command immediately lost contact with Leon. They weren't sure what happened. Maybe a grenade hit him and the recording system was trashed. Maybe Leon was dead. They feared the worst, that the mission was a failure. That is, until a few hours later when they received word that the facility was gone. Not just the reactor, but the entire facility was gone. It was as if somebody, once again, had taken a shaped charge and loaded it with a nuclear bomb. They theorized that where the reactor would have been was the detonation site. The entire facility completely gone. Even trees upwards of nearly 50 kilometers out had been completely turned to dust and sawdust. The level of destruction was impossible, and to be frank, High Command wasn't entirely sure how this had happened. Nevertheless, the mission was a success. Unfortunately, the entire team, some of the best soldiers that they had been wiped out. The Cyratin Empire ended up sending down a task force to secure the facility, or at least the territory around it, and slowly move in towards the facility, just to make sure that there wasn't anything potentially dangerous. They didn't want to land directly at it. Eventually, they discovered that there was quite literally nothing but wreckage in the area, and as a result, they set up camp. They wanted to test to see what exactly it was that went down there, as they had no information on what actually occurred. Roughly 2 or 3 days in, some of the soldiers on the outskirts of the camp had noticed something. There was a lightning anomaly or a lightning elemental off in the distance. It was kind of just sitting there. Nobody was entirely sure what the hell it was, and even after firing a few shots at it to try and scare it away or antagonize it to see if it was hostile, both kinetic and energy rounds seemed to just simply disappear before hitting it. Even after shooting at it, however, it didn't seem to do anything. As a result, the soldiers decided that they were going to keep an eye on it and inform their superiors, which basically said the same thing, keep an eye on it. Slowly but surely, this anomaly got closer and closer. Eventually, it took on a human-like form, which was, needless to say, rather bizarre. At this point, they knew it wasn't an anomaly, this was an elemental, but it was the most passive elemental that they had ever witnessed. You see, normally elementals are hostile to anything that isn't a fellow elemental, and typically they'll even attack other elementals depending on what elemental it is. But this one was completely passive. Not only that, but no matter what they tried to do, they couldn't really interact with it, as it seemed to quite literally disintegrate anything that got close to it. As a result, they kind of just gave it a wide berth, until finally it decided that it was going to post up in the very center of the camp. Needless to say, this was incredibly inconvenient. However, one day, a soldier walking by had noticed something. One of the light fixtures was flickering, clearly being manipulated by this elemental, but the longer he looked at it, the more he realized that this wasn't just random flickering. He immediately got his official, or his commanding officer, and brought him out. The officer was understandably very annoyed because this soldier wanted to show him a flickering light that was being caused by a lightning elemental. Of course it's affecting the light. But once again, the official decided to humor him, and the longer he watched, the more he realized that there was a pattern. Eventually, he realized what this pattern was. It was an ancient, absolutely ancient, and no longer used form of communication that humanity had invented. The fact that this official even understood what it was a testament to just how bored he was one day. It turns out this flickering was Morse code. However, needless to say, doing it simply as a pastime to shave off boredom, he wasn't exactly an expert in Morse code, and it took quite a while, but eventually he decoded it. It said, "I am Leon." Needless to say, this was rather confusing. Why was this lightning elemental, who somehow knew Morse code, was sending a message that could have possibly been interpreted incorrectly, be saying, "I am Leon"? He decided to ignore it until it decided that it was going to start affecting every single light in the camp. Every single light flickering on and off in the same pattern of Morse code all at once. At this point, it became too much to ignore, and the official decided to tell his commanding officer. Eventually, this got all the way up to the Cyratin Supreme Commander, who, needless to say, was rather curious. Why would a lightning elemental be saying it's Leon? So, he decided that he was going to make this somebody else's problem and make sure that they took it seriously. They ended up essentially jury-rigging a device that could best be described as an old-school radio, which the elemental was then capable of interacting with. It was incredibly robotic, difficult to understand, but there was a voice there. And, furthermore, other than the fact that it was saying "I am Leon" over and over again, when an officer put a question to it, it paused. Every single light in the camp stopped flickering. And then the radio replied. Interestingly enough, this wasn't incoherent babble. This was a clear, concise answer, or, well, as clear as it can be. Eventually, he started asking more questions, and it continued to answer. Then he started asking questions only a member of the Cyratin military would know. Again, it answered correctly. Then it started asking questions under the direct order of his official that only a Cyratin special operative would know. And once again, every single answer was correct. At this point, they didn't have any other choice. They had to believe that this was Leon. The fact that it knew all of these answers was not coincidental. As a result, the radio was refined further and was eventually created into a voice module that the elemental could interact with and actually speak, ironically enough, in Leon's voice. Needless to say, this unnerved quite a few people, as having a lightning elemental standing there talking in Leon's voice is unsettling to say the very least. Eventually, they created a harness that it could inhabit and was even capable of controlling via electrical impulses. Now it had a body and a voice. It was essentially Leon at this point. And when they finally decided to ask how he got to this point, Leon said something rather interesting. He said he wasn't entirely certain, but he theorized that the direct moment in which he accelerated himself to light speed, his entire being was being transmuted into magic. Now, in order to really drive home this idea, we need to talk about something we've talked about before, and that is mana imbuement. When you get to be a specifically powerful mage, you may be able to use mana imbuement, where you imbue your elemental mana throughout your entire body, thus being able to channel more of your magic at once. Unfortunately, the more you use this and the longer you use it, your body starts very slowly being transmuted into magic, until finally, you are finally transmuted into an elemental. Your soul is lost, and now you're just simply an elemental that'll attack anything around it. Leon theorized that due to the fact that he had accelerated himself to light speed and then delivered such an impossibly powerful punch, that it most likely instantaneously transmuted his body and soul into magic. This would allow him to bypass the slow corruption of his soul until there's nothing left. If it was instantaneously transmuted, his soul would then become magic, being intermingled with the magic of the elemental body he now inhabited, thus allowing him to keep his self. Needless to say, this was groundbreaking and revolutionary. There were mages all across the Cyratin Empire that came just simply to interact and study Leon, as this was a first. Nobody had ever seen an elemental that had maintained, or rather retained, its personality and mind. Leon was the very first. Needless to say, he became an academic anomaly, and the majority of the time he couldn't even do his job, due to the fact that he was constantly being swarmed by various different types of scholars and scientists. Moving forward a great deal of time, Leon eventually got rid of all of those scholars and had a slightly imperceptible change to his overall personality. He was becoming far more aggressive on the battlefield, possibly due to the fact that so long as there was mana in the environment around him, due to the fact that Leon was now an elemental, he really couldn't die unless he was hit with a sufficiently powerful spell. As a result, energy and ballistics weaponry did very little to deter him. It was theorized that he got this form of almost fearlessness and attacked with reckless abandon, oftentimes the body or housing that he inhabited being completely and utterly destroyed on the battlefield and a new one having to be made. Needless to say, this was becoming quite the expensive project for the Cyratin Empire, but he was gaining an incredible amount of notoriety. Not only this, but he was completing more missions at a much higher success rate with far fewer casualties. The Cyratin Empire couldn't exactly just push him off to the side and say enough with this, because his record, or rather what he was doing was just far too good for the Cyratin Empire. Eventually, a unfortunate situation would occur. The Cyratin's Supreme Commander Marcus Bane would end up going missing. Nobody knew where he went. Well, there were some people who knew where he went, but the majority of people didn't, especially high-ranking officers of the military. Suddenly, there was a massive power vacuum, and somebody had to fill this position. Bizarrely enough, despite the fact that he was formerly human and now an elemental, it was almost unanimously voted that Leon would take the position of Cyratin's Supreme Commander. And he was eventually and officially enrolled into the position. However, Leon wasn't like most Supreme Commanders of the past. Marcus Bane begrudgingly kept himself off of the battlefield purely out of necessity. Others simply just weren't warriors and thus just sat in the chair the whole time whilst giving out orders when needed. Leon, on the other hand, led from the front line. He was one of the first Cyratin Supreme Commanders to do this. Marcus Bane had done it from time to time, but nowhere near as often as Leon. In fact, high-ranking officials and the High Cyratin Commander themselves had a hell of a time just trying to get him back into the office to actually do his job rather than continuing to go out on a war path. Eventually, they noticed something. With the recent increase in overall military assets that Leon had access to, while he certainly wasn't... What's a good way to put it? He wasn't using these assets in... Basically, he wasn't wasting things. He wasn't wasting lives, he wasn't wasting military assets, but he was significantly more aggressive than he was before. Now, this is all leading up to a very important event, and this is known as the Astrian War. Now, the main part of the Astrian War occurred before Leon took office as a Supreme Commander, and even before Marcus Bane went missing. The Astrian War is centered around a planet known as Astria. It is an absolutely vital planet for the Cyratin Empire for its supply lines. During this time, the Cyratin Empire was at war with multiple different factions, which for the Cyratin Empire isn't very uncommon. However, Astria was an incredibly profitable and fertile agri-world. In fact, when it comes to the Cyratin Empire, it produced nearly 5% of all food exports for the wider Cyratin Empire. If we put this into comparison to 99% of all agri-worlds, they produce less than 0.01% of the total food production. Astria was an insanely profitable planet due to how fertile the planet was in terms of the soil. However, unfortunately, humanity and the Bastilians had noticed this, and the Astrian War had started. Astria became a planet of incredible import to both of these factions. Now, in order to fully understand the playing field here, we're going to be talking about the total territory for all factions. So, we're going to have this like a circle, a 2D circle. In the center, as well as to the south, is the total territory of the Cyratin Empire. To the southeast is the Barramon faction, going up all the way to west by southwest. Right? Did I say southwest or did I say southeast? I meant southwest. So southwest all the way up to west by southwest is Barramon territory. Directly to the west is humanity. Followed by that all the way up to north by northwest is where the Blight Plague usually hang out, and directly adjacent to them is the Florians. Finally, we have to the northeast, where the Barramon, or the Bastilians are, Northeast is where the Bastilians are, going all the way down to direct east, and direct east all the way down to the south is Yvetan territory. Needless to say, this is quite a complex map. However, an important thing to know is that Astria was located directly in between humanity and the Bastilians. Now, during this time, the Cyratin Empire had two primary wars that were considered far more important, this being a sudden onslaught from the Florians to the north, as well as a massive mobilization of Barramon to the southwest. These two wars were considered absolutely vital, and as a result, the Cyratin Empire was divvying up a massive amount of supplies to both of these wars, not really paying attention to the Yvetans, the Bastilians, and the humans. That is, until this war ended up happening. During this time, humanity and Bastilians, largely unopposed due to the mass allocation of resources to the other two wars, were slowly pushing further and further into Cyratin-held territory, causing this little area to slowly get pinched together. If this war ended up panning out for either of their sides, the Cyratin Empire would lose access to the entire north, which the north part of their territory was very important and likely why the Florians were attacking in the first place. This is due to the fact that within reality, the northern area is incredibly resource rich. This area was considered to be a must-have for the Cyratin Empire, but the majority of other factions didn't really know just how profitable this area was. Needless to say, if they were to lose it due to a complete severing from the human and Bastilian factions, this would be cataclysmic. Roughly about halfway through this war is when Leon was officially nominated as Cyratin's Supreme Commander, and he went on an absolutely unstoppable war path. He pulled back nearly 85% of all military assets on the Barramon front due to the fact that the sheer amount of resources they were being allocated was far too much, and took nearly 3/5 of the Cyratin Holy Armada and went absolutely berserk on the humans and Bastilians. Now, we've talked about the Holy Armada before, and we've talked about just how insanely massive it is. The Holy Armada itself is divvied up into 5 different branches or 5 different tendrils. Each of these 5 is typically focused on one of the main lines of each faction, of the other factions. One is for the Barramon, one is for the Bastilians, one is for the humans, one is for the Yvetans, and one is for the Florians. As a result, their main armada is focused on all 5 war fronts, which is how they're capable of holding the line as well as they do, despite the fact that they're typically at war with all 5 of them. Leon took 3/5, 3 entire battlefronts of the Holy Armada, and went to the humans and the Bastilians, and unleashed a truly savage level of carnage, to the point where even the highest ranking members of the military were kind of unsure about putting Leon as Supreme Commander. However, the Cyratin Emperor had ordered it after receiving the nominations. He said that Leon was the best person for the job. As a result, the humans and Bastilians lost an astonishing amount of forces. The planet, the Agri-World, was held. However, the level of brutality that was unleashed was unheard of before. Just after this war had concluded, however, something unexpected had occurred. You see, right after the end of this war, Leon was seen as quite literally a national hero. Well, national, maybe not the correct term here, but he was seen as a hero throughout the entirety of the Cyratin Empire. He had forced back major offensives from the human and Bastilian fronts with little to no resistance whatsoever. Keep in mind, these weren't just patrol fleets that were going in there. These were multiple hundreds of death fleets going deep into Cyratin-held territory in an attempt to take this planet. And he was capable of holding it all off with relatively minor losses. During the end of this event, Marcus Bane had suddenly reappeared. And just before Marcus Bane had come in, the Cyratin Empire had received a shocking and crushing news. Cyratin Supreme Commander Leon had been assassinated on the battlefield. Not long after that, Cyratin Supreme Commander Marcus Bane was rediscovered and retook his position due to the loss of Leon. Needless to say, the Cyratin Empire was absolutely devastated. This was a soldier who had time and time again shown unwavering loyalty to the Cyratin Empire, an impossible level of skill, and an overwhelming amount of determination to protect it no matter the cost. And they had just lost one of their 3 heroes. Unbeknownst to anybody, however, Leon was actually alive. You see, what had actually happened is Marcus Bane had been sent out on his own form of special ops mission by direct order of the Cyratin Emperor at the time, which was the legendary Jackson. As a result, he was indisposed and couldn't participate in his official job. When Zach had discovered that Leon was one of the nominees, he realized that Leon would be the perfect person for this job, especially for what would come after, and ordered Leon into the position of Supreme Commander. When Marcus Bane was coming back from his mission, however, there was a bit of a problem. A problem that everybody had already agreed on ahead of time. You see, the rank of Supreme Commander is similar to the Pope, in that it's a lifelong service. There's no retiring from Supreme Commander. You go until you die, or you're just incapable of doing your job. With Marcus Bane coming back, and the Cyratin Empire desperately needing Marcus Bane in general, there was only one option. Leon had to be assassinated. Of course, Leon wasn't actually assassinated. What the Cyratin Empire did was they made a body double and put an AI in it, and then had it march onto the battlefield in front of an overwhelming amount of soldiers and have it get killed on the battlefield. Thus, to the soldiers' point of view, their Supreme Commander Leon had just been killed on the battlefield. This was irrefutable evidence. So, what had actually happened is Leon was kept at a secure location and was basically kept from the public. Due to the fact that Leon didn't have an actual body, but rather a mechanical body that his elemental form had inhabited, they could easily change what he looked like. And that's exactly what they did. A few months after the death of Cyratin's Supreme Commander Leon, a brand new person spontaneously appeared within the Cyratin military. You see, at the time, the High Cyratin Commander was an individual known as... She was known as Scarlet Eclair, and she was known as the Fire Witch. She was an incredibly powerful fire mage that was capable of quite literally burning everything around her and melting things just simply by her magical presence alone. Basically think Duran, but less absolutely insanely overpowered. And you get the idea. She had suddenly said to the wider public that she was stepping down from her position and that a brand new High Cyratin commander had already been chosen. This, needless to say, had shocked the Cyratin Empire. Not only had they lost Leon, whilst they did get Marcus Bane back, but now another near-legendary individual within the Empire was stepping down and disappearing from the wider Cyratin military. There was a lot of talk and a lot of concern. This brand new individual was known as High Cyratin Commander Zyon, which is the actual topic of today's episode. High Cyratin Commander Zyon, formerly known as Leon. Zyon had decided that his personality needed a bit of a tune-up. If he still acted the same way as Leon, there might be some people out there that draw connections, and right now that's not something the Cyratin Empire really needed, especially given the fact that the Cyratin Empire needed to fully believe that Cyratin Supreme Commander Leon was dead. As a result, Zyon became unbelievably brutal, leading warpaths of levels of savagery that this war hadn't even seen before, going on massive warpaths of pure scorched earth. Zyon quickly gained notoriety, or maybe infamy is a better word, as an absolutely savage warlord. As a result, he was officially given the title the Crimson Warlord, as it was quite often to see him quite literally marching across the battlefield, unintentionally bathed in the blood of his enemies, as he quite usually favored melee combat. Marching across the battlefield, seemingly completely unaffected by any incoming munitions, and completely and utterly unstoppable, completely inexhaustible on the battlefield. He continued to march relentlessly towards the soldiers, dead set on their total extermination no matter the cost. Now, Zyon had eventually decided to post up on a planet known as Thalcia. Now, it should be noted that we're still behind the current level of lore. This is not the same Thalcia as the current Cyratin Empire, which Thalcia is the Cyratin capital world. This is a completely different Thalcia at the time, and it was essentially a glitter backwater world, similar to the one that Raymond had grew up on, but again, the one that Raymond had grew up on was still a completely different one. The Cyratin Empire quite commonly used the same names over various different Cyratin empires, just to kind of keep things a little bit more simplistic. As a result, the name Thalcia has been used on multiple different planets for multiple different Cyratin empires. During the time of Zyon coming to power, Raymond wasn't even born yet. But regardless, eventually, having continued his absolutely brutal warpath, the citizens of Thalcia gave him the unofficial title of the Thalcian Executioner. And he continued on his warpath for an incredibly long time, seemingly to have the full endorsement of not only Cyratin Supreme Commander Marcus Bane, but the full endorsement of Cyratin Emperor Zach Jackson to do whatever the hell he damn well pleased. And he took that to the extremes. Whilst he never did anything that would overtly cause problems for the Cyratin Empire, he certainly used a lot of military assets, sometimes rather dubiously, to ensure that any objective that he created in his mind would be completed, no matter the cost. Eventually, however, everything came to a head. You see, during this time, the Cyratin Empire had actually created a holy Cyrita. We talked about this before. This is the massive, multiple times larger than Jupiter synthetic planet that the Cyratin Empire has made 3 times over the course of 32 separate Cyratin empires. It is a monumental undertaking that requires quite literally multiple universes worth of resources just to get this thing operational, due to its sheer size and its unbelievable capabilities. Eventually, a war would break out on Cyrita. The majority of important individuals, these being the 10 great natural disasters, weren't able to get to the battlefield. Thankfully, during that time, guess who was on Holy Cyrita? The Crimson Warlord himself, High Cyratin Commander Zyon. Up to this point, he had gained notoriety as an incredibly savage and brutal individual on the battlefield. However, when Holy Cyrita was attacked, he took this to 11. Formerly at maybe like a 7 or 8. He unleashed such devastating amounts of damage to the enemy forces that before they had even made any leeway on Cyrita itself, which was a wonder they even got on the planet, they were already in full retreat. At which point, Zyon immediately got on a shuttle, got on one of the most powerful ships in orbit, and led the entire Cyrita defense fleet in a massive counter-assault that saw nearly the entirety of every single enemy vessel obliterated. And keep in mind, during this war, it was a joint effort between humanity, the Bastilians, and the Barramon. This was an incredibly massive war. And Zyon almost single-handedly had forced back all 3 factions. It was at this point he was given a second official title. Now, we've talked about this with Isaiah. For somebody to be given a title in the Cyratin Empire means they are somebody who is insanely important. To get 2 titles is nearly unheard of. Like, you are a person whose importance to the Cyratin Empire is completely and utterly unquestionable. Your importance is like on the level of the Cyratin Emperor at that point. He was given the title the Cyratin Praetorian. However, Zyon was not done. You see, it was not long after this that a project came to light to Zyon's knowledge. We've talked about this specific concept before, void lightning. It is a semi-unnatural phenomena that occurs in the void of space whenever there are areas of particularly dense fleet-to-fleet combat. The void of space itself is charged, which gives rise to void lightning, which is quite literally capable of cutting through shields and hulls like they're nothing but warm butter. The Cyratin Empire, never knowing when to quit, decided that they wanted to see if they can't weaponize this, and decided to create the Voidmancer project, essentially try and make a mage capable of using void lightning. This goes about as well as you can imagine, and resulted in a quite uncomfortable amount of disintegrations, in all honesty, all of them being volunteer, by the way. That is until Zyon. Zyon was absolutely determined that he was going to become a part of this. He believed that due to the fact that he was a lightning elemental, he had a higher chance of actually succeeding where everyone else had failed and been disintegrated. It took a long time for Zyon to convince them, but eventually Zyon was able to convince the Cyratin Supreme Commander Marcus Bane to actually greenlight it. And as a result, Zyon was officially one of the subjects of the Voidmancer project. Unfortunately, at least initially, it seemed as though Zyon had went out the same way that everyone else did. When introduced with solely his lightning elemental body to void lightning, he appeared to be instantaneously disintegrated. How exactly you disintegrate lightning isn't exactly known, but that's exactly what happened. Needless to say, everybody was devastated. Not only had they lost Cyratin Supreme Commander Leon, but now they just lost High Cyratin Commander Zyon, whose importance to the Cyratin Empire was irrefutably massive. However, they continued with the project, and they kind of kept it a little tight-lipped for a while. Until finally the project was decommissioned due to the fact that there was no successful instances. The facility was being reconverted for another black site purpose when the testing chamber suddenly had an abnormality. All of the lights in that wing of the facility suddenly and spontaneously started exploding. Void lightning was running rampant through the facility, causing multiple structural damage instances. Eventually, they managed to get a team to the containment site, and what they saw they couldn't believe. It was a ball of void lightning that was hanging in the air, firing off void lightning in every single direction. Multiple members of the team had nearly been killed on sight due to void lightning nearly hitting them. But every single time, the void lightning would just narrowly miss them. Eventually, they did some tests as they wanted to figure out what the hell this floating ball of void lightning was and why it was here and so incredibly agitated. And they, ironically enough, did the exact same initial process as when they found Leon. They had multiple different instruments and it started interacting with them. One specifically was an old school radio, which it was capable of creating a interference-like noise that was approximate to a voice. And it said that its name was Zyon, and it was incredibly pissed off for whatever reason. As a result, the Cyratin Empire decided that, okay, we're going to take this at face value, especially the Cyratin Supreme Commander and Emperor, who knew the whole story of Leon's initial reappearance. They were like, we're going to take this at face value. This is clearly Zyon. We have no idea how he did it, but he clearly has survived somehow. But we need to find a way to maintain his physical form, as due to the current state he was incredibly volatile. As a result, they suspended him in time, which trying to suspend void lightning in time is rather inefficient, as it's still capable of moving around despite the fact that time is quite literally paused. But it was enough. They could contain him, they could safely interact with him. It was less of a prison cell and more of a quarantine type of situation. That was until a different project at a different black site, as the Cyratin Empire were constantly trying to figure out how to give him a body. A different black site with a different project had a resounding success. Still working with void lightning, but with a completely different premise of trying to use it in technology. They created something known as the Lightning Gauntlet. The Lightning Gauntlet is a gauntlet of an unidentified substance that the Cyratin Empire really didn't understand at the time, that was capable of resisting void lightning to the point where it could be temporarily wreathed in it and even launch void lightning from the gauntlet. Unfortunately, this would cause catastrophic damage to the gauntlet itself, which means every single time they wanted one of these, they had to quite literally remove the old one and put on a new one. As a result, it was saved as a tactical necessity rather than a mainstream weapon. Well, needless to say, the scientists in charge of Zyon immediately got a hold of this and started experimenting with it. Many failed experiments later, they managed to create a enhanced form of this that was capable of withstanding Zyon's body for X amount of time. However, it would still require being replaced. They eventually created 2 different shells for his body. The inner shell, which was made of this hyper void lightning resistant material, and the outer part of his body, which was indistinguishable from his old Zyon body. As a result, they could quite literally just re-sleeve the outer body with the new inner body any time that it was needed, but constantly researching on various different ways to get this material even more durable. Eventually, they managed to do it. Now, unfortunately, we don't know the specifics behind this because this is a black site, not only this, but it's involving one of the highest ranking members of the military. This isn't something that's ever going to come to light. The Cyratin Empire is going to keep this a secret to the day that they die. The material's composition is so incredibly resistant to void lightning that whilst it still requires being replaced, it's capable of surviving direct contact with his void lightning body for tens, hundreds of years, and that was considered to be good enough. Unfortunately, due to the process of creating this material, they weren't really capable of integrating it with the Lightning Gauntlet project. And as a result, the material, or rather the enhanced form of the material, was kept incredibly quiet, only utilized on Zyon and Zyon alone. As a result, Zyon is now void lightning, a void lightning elemental inside of a body. There are specific parts of his body that can be opened up and unleash a torrent of void lightning in any direction of his choosing, simply by just gaining access to the interior of his body where his actual void lightning body is. And as you can imagine, he is even more brutal, more ruthless, and more savage on the battlefield, and even more efficient on the battlefield, as he's quite literally capable of just pointing his hand at something, having his hand split in half, and just thickly coating the entire battlefield in void lightning. It was around this time that he was officially given a 3rd title due to his constant and almost excessive use of this void lightning power that he now had. He was given the title the Lord of the Abyssal Storm. And, as a bonus, the old unofficial title, the Thalcian Executioner, was also made official. High Cyratin Commander Zyon was the first individual in Cyratin history, in any Cyratin Empire's history, to have been given 4 full official titles. These being the Cyratin Praetorian, the Lord of the Abyssal Storm, the Crimson Warlord, and the Thalcian Executioner. Needless to say, the importance of Zyon in the Cyratin Empire is completely and utterly uncontested, having almost more importance to the Cyratin Empire than the Cyratin Emperor themselves. Unfortunately, that is where we're going to be leaving this episode. We'll be going over a lot of various different lore on Zyon when it comes in, as there is a lot of stuff about Zyon. He's one of the characters I've put the most thought into, and he is absolutely critical in the Ruin War. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I hope you guys are looking forward to Wednesday and Friday's Surviving Mars episodes, as well as Saturday and Sunday's live streams at noon Central Standard Time, where we're probably going to end up doing them. I say probably because it's obviously Christmas weekend, where we're going to be doing RimWorld on Saturday and Sunday Night Live on Sunday. And then coming right back here next Tuesday with another episode of Shattered Legacies Deep Dive. So, until then, guys, see ya.